Okay, this is our video where we get into topic 4.4, Maritime Empires Established. And the focus of this, since we've already gone through a lot of the maritime empires, is to focus on understanding the new world created by transoceanic interconnections. We know that nation states emerged in Europe and that all were motivated to expand, mostly for economic reasons. And we also know that they built their maritime empires to fulfill these economic goals, but also to make sure that they remain powerful within Europe. So this occurred in two waves. You have the Iberian or the Southern wave between 1450 and 1600. Then you have the Northern wave. What we don't know, or what we want to know, is how did the network of exchange change and remain the same from 1450 to 1750? So our essential question today is explain the continuities and changes, focusing specifically on economic systems, but also including some other processes that we've covered throughout the year. So this is basically the world that trade made. As you can see, the nation states of Europe, using maritime routes, established trading post empires in the Eastern Hemisphere and colonial empires in the Western Hemisphere. Now, when we look at the big picture, how is this changing or how is this evolving the economic relations that we've seen since 1200? Well, we begin with, first of all, what continued. On a global scale, we're still after the similar goods that we've been working with since 1200: pepper, cotton, spices, slaves, gold, and a couple other things were still in very high demand and used by the nation states of Europe to be able to bring in wealth. So we've got that continuity followed up by the state involvement. The state is going to be very involved in any economic activity, all the way from 1200 to about 1750. And the reason why states are always involved, especially the land empires and the nation states, would be their economic motivations. They need wealth for their nation to be able to make their population, especially the upper class, happy, to pay for their bureaucracy, to pay for their army, and to purchase the gunpowder weapons, and finally build and maintain their palaces. So the wealth motive, not only to run the government, but also to please the population, was essentially a continuity during this entire time period. Now, the way that they got this gold and silver, now we're beginning to get into some changes. So it used to be this, they taxed, they tried to trade. Now we've got set ways to bring in gold, and another change would be silver. We find it, we grow commodities for it, or we become the middlemen and trade for it. Another continuity would be land empires. Land empires and even trading states have existed since 1200. We've seen not only the Song dynasty of China, but also the Yuan dynasty all the way up into the Ming and the Qing. We see the trading kingdoms in India being absorbed under one empire called the Mughals. We see the rise of other land empires and the evolution of certain trading states in Africa. This was a continuity. Now, the change is going to be the rise of these nation states. Okay, so when we begin to look at the specific changes on the global, the first thing is global trade. We have connected an existing trade route, the Indian Ocean system, with two new trading systems, the Atlantic system and the Pacific system. Also, we do see a big change, and this would be a political change, in the rise of maritime empires. This is a graphic that shows that land empires really have remained powerful and don't really begin to diminish until after 1800. But starting in about 1450, maritime empires are growing in power and will eventually pass them in importance, power, and control. The reason why is that the Europeans who are making these maritime empires have a great technological advantage that they're exploiting and using. Another change would be the beginnings of specialization. And from this, we're talking about specifically specific roles in the world economy. For example, the Eastern Hemisphere became a great area of production for, we can still call them luxury goods, and simply just demanded silver. Here, the Europeans focus on becoming the middlemen. Whereas the Western Hemisphere, well, this really was colonies and commodities production and a little bit of market. Now, Europe's role in this is going to be making finished goods. So instead of just seeing, these specialized goods flowing, but everybody pretty much doing the same thing, now we're beginning to see some specialization, not just on the individual level, but on the national level and the regional level. Another big change that we brought up before was the global flow of silver. We know that the three biggest sources for silver were in third place Tokugawa, Japan, in second place Zacatecas, and in first place Potosi. Well, if we study the flow of all this silver, it's flowing mostly into Asia, being the Mughals and the Ming Chinese, but it's also flowing into Europe a bit. And this flow of silver, this circulation, is going to be the commercial idea, which is going to make this trade network work. Okay, so what we're seeing is that instead of gold for commodities or commodities for commodities, the barter, now we're seeing silver being the main ways of getting these commodities. So when we specifically look at continuity and changes in the Eastern Hemisphere, okay, what stayed the same? How trade was conducted. I mean, we still see middlemen carrying finished goods between entry pot cities, even though the Europeans showed up and made their own trading posts within these cities. It's still the same trade relationship that we have looked at before. Okay. The big change is going to be the development of trading posts, meaning that Europeans are going to have control of maybe something as small as an actual building, or in some cases, especially toward 1750, entire cities that they're focusing on, controlling trade through. Okay. Second thing is that this is where a majority of the world silver went, especially into the Indian Ocean system, because both the Mughals and the Chinese, they were very, very wanting silver. And then finally, we begin to see some pullback. Both Ming and Qing China and Tokugawa Japan, where they begin to feel very threatened by the Europeans. And they take steps to first restrict, and then in the case of Japan, totally close themselves from the outsides. The reason why this is specifically the westernized culture and the Christian religion that the Europeans were bringing essentially were threats to the unifying and legitimizing ideas based on their religion in both China and Japan. The Mughals really did not begin to try to limit their involvement, and essentially it's going to lead to bad things after 1750. Another thing is that we see the rise of new trading states in Africa, most importantly the Ashanti and the Kingdom of Congo, that are controlling trade because of those diseases that we spoke of before. Europeans could not go in the interior. So these kingdoms became very powerful because they were controlling the trade of slaves with the Europeans, and they received gunpowder weapons. When we look at the Western Hemisphere and talk about continuities, well, you guessed it, there really wasn't any. Okay, so the changes that we're going to focus on is they're going to become connected to the network of communication and exchange. This is going to be the site where we see colonies develop, specific possessions of foreign nations in the Americas. Their main claim to fame is going to be cash crop production. They focused on new labor systems, which I will get into in the next video. And so when we look at the big picture, to prepare for this test, you should be able to identify and describe an economic continuity in world trade, an economic change in world trade. So the continuity is I would, talk about government involvement, talk about, how things flowed, and then with the economic change, definitely global circulation, adding the Americas, it becomes maritime, and also don't forget about silver trade. And economic continuity trade in the Eastern Hemisphere, well, we're still dealing with the same pattern. But when we look at an economic change, okay, we see silver, we see the European presence, and we also begin to see the Chinese and the Japanese pull back. And then when we focus on the economic change in the Western Hemisphere, we're really looking at, how they were colonized and things like that. So this answers our question, explain the continuities and changes in economic systems from 1450 to 1750. In a later video and throughout the other videos, I'm going to specifically address the other areas where we see changes.